Deep in the mountains of western Virginia, where fog weaves between ancient pines and time itself seems frozen in the 1920s, lies a place America chose to forget. Odd, a tiny Appalachian community has become synonymous with what modern society deems an absolute taboo: generations of marriage between direct relatives. Flanked by rusty trailers and wooden houses defying gravity, the narrow dirt road leading to the Whitaker property is uneven and rough. Kilometers before you arrive, GPS signals fail. It is as if technology itself refuses to acknowledge this place exists. In 2020, photographer and documentary filmmaker Mark Leiter ventured into these hills with a camera and a haunting question: how could an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriage? What he discovered was a reality that challenges any fiction. The Whitakers are not merely an isolated case of inbreeding. They represent the extreme outcome of generations of geographical isolation, profound poverty, and traditions perpetuated for over a century. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whitaker are siblings who bear in body and mind the marks of a genetic lineage turned inward upon itself. Ray, the eldest, suffers severe physical malformations. His head is disproportionately small, a condition known as microcephaly. He communicates only through grunts and gestures, his intellectual capacity deeply compromised. Lorraine, the sole sister, has clear facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent normal walking. Though able to speak a few words, Timmy lives with severe intellectual disability. His face carries the unmistakable stamps of consanguinity, asymmetry, serious dental issues, and an empty gaze reflecting decades of social isolation. Freddie, the youngest, is the only one capable of basic conversation, yet even he shows clear cognitive impairment. What shocks most is not merely the visible deformities, but the naturalness with which this family accepts their condition. For them, this is the only reality they have ever known. No mirrors hang in their house. No television shows them other families. No reference from the outside world allows them to understand how profoundly different they are. The home they inhabit is a collection of rooms without electric light, running water, or modern comfort. The smell of mold and neglect permeates every corner. In the backyard, piles of accumulated trash form small mountains of debris. It is impossible to tell where the garbage ends and what they consider personal belongings begins. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because this is one of the most extreme and documented stories of consanguinity ever recorded in the United States, and you won't find details like these anywhere else. To understand how the Whitakers reached this point, one must return to the 19th century, when the first settlers made their homes in the isolated western Virginia mountains. The Appalachian region has always been defined by extreme geographical isolation. Entire communities formed in deep valleys, separated by insurmountable ridges and kilometers of dense forest. The geography here is brutal and merciless. Mountains rising abruptly over 1,200 meters create narrow, secluded valleys where small communities develop their own culture, language, and traditions across generations. Winter snows can cut off these communities for months, forcing families to depend entirely on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that when small groups remain geographically isolated for generations, the gene pool becomes progressively limited. What happened in Appalachia is a classic example of genetic drift in small founder populations, Wells states in his 2018 research published in the Journal of Medical Genetics. He details the population bottleneck concept. When a population shrinks dramatically and stays isolated, it loses available genetic diversity, creating a vicious cycle that leads to obligatory consanguinity. Appalachian history is filled with similar examples. During the colonial era, whole families migrated to remote valleys seeking autonomy and isolation from federal authority. Many brought ancient European traditions, including marriage practices already considered problematic. The Whitaker roots in the region are documented since 1887, when John Whitaker settled in Odd with his wife Sarah. Census records show marriages between first-degree cousins began in the second generation. By the third generation, unions between siblings and half-siblings became common practice, not by choice, but from an absolute lack of options. Archives of the local Methodist Church, preserved in Charleston's historical library, reveal disturbing details on how these unions were formalized religiously. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community from 1920 to 1945, kept meticulous records of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages describing his growing concern over the irregular unions he was forced to bless. One entry, dated June 23, 1934, reads, "Today I performed the wedding of Mary Whitaker to her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 and already shows signs of mental disability. Henry is not much better. Both are children of a union between father and daughter. God help them." Such entries continue for years, documenting progressively more troubling marriages. Morrison recorded at least 12 unions between first-degree relatives in the Whitaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his anguish, but also his powerlessness against a tradition that persisted regardless of his approval. The isolation was not just geographical, it was cultural, religious, and economic. The Whitakers belonged to a fundamentalist sect that viewed the outside world as sinful and corrupt. Marrying outside the family was not only impractical geographically, it was seen as a betrayal of family and religious values. This sect, known locally as the Church of the Elect, developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal manuscripts found on the property interpret biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the purity of the bloodline. The genetic consequences became apparent by the fourth generation. Medical records from Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 Whitaker children were born with severe disabilities, 8 died before age 5. Prolonged inbreeding results in what geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which normally remain inactive when one marries a genetically distant partner, become dominant when both parents carry the same mutations. In the case of the Whitakers, genetic analysis by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed the modern siblings have a coefficient of consanguinity of 0.355, meaning they are genetically closer than even normal siblings born to the same parents. This indicates their own parents were the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To put this in perspective, Dr. Bamshad explains, a coefficient of 0.375 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, the children of normal siblings would be 0.25. What we see in the Whitakers suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of very close kin coupling. This level of consanguinity results in extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the case, describes it as a perfect example of the worst possible scenario in human genetics. She continues, "What we see in the Whitakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly inbred laboratory strain. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations it's a miracle they survived to adulthood. Their immune systems, neurological development, bone structure, and cardiac function are all compromised by this extreme genetic load." Detailed tests revealed the Whitaker siblings carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed at once. In a normal population, the chance of carrying even 5 such expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whitakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. The physical malformations are just the tip of the iceberg. Congenital heart problems, partial deafness, chronic kidney issues, and a severely compromised immune system are part of their daily reality. Ray suffers severe epilepsy with seizures lasting hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that leave her constantly gasping. The most disturbing aspect is that these siblings are the survivors. Church documents indicate at least 7 other siblings were stillborn or died in childhood from malformations incompatible with life. The 4 who survived are, paradoxically, the least severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have ended decades ago. The perpetuation of consanguinity in this family cannot be understood as mere individual choice. It is the result of a complex system of isolation, poverty, and ignorance that has fed itself for over a century. Betty Whitaker, a distant cousin who escaped in the 1970s, offers a shocking account of the internal family dynamics. "No one explained anything to anyone," she told filmmaker Mark Leiter. Girls got pregnant by their own brothers, fathers, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education. No knowledge of genetics. No alternatives. Now 73 and living in a Charleston nursing home, Betty bears her own physical and emotional scars from life on the property. She has minor finger deformities and slight facial asymmetry, signs she, too, is a product of consanguinity, though to a far lesser degree than her cousins. I was considered the normal one in the family, Betty recalls bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple sums, it gave me enough courage to escape at 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver gave me a ride to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that show how inbreeding was institutionalized. There was a ceremony called the Blessing of Purity when a girl turned 14. The family patriarch, in my time, old Thomas Whitaker, would choose which male relative would be that girl's guardian. It didn't matter if it was her father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians had exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Resisting meant severe punishment, isolation in a dark cellar, food deprivation, or beatings leaving permanent marks. My younger sister Rebecca tried to escape 3 times, Betty remembers, tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to ensure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at 23, giving birth to her 5th child. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not just tolerated but encouraged by patriarchs as a way to maintain pure blood and keep property within the family. Old John always said Whitaker blood was pure blood, and mixing with others was a sin. Raleigh County social assistance records reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whitaker children had the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own daughters or sisters. The legal system largely ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you, too, feel the weight of this story, comment now, how does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? Formal education never existed for the current Whitakers. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie never attended school. They cannot read, write, or perform basic math. Their only knowledge of the world comes from conversations with equally isolated and ignorant relatives. For them, their condition is normal, it is the only reality they know. Tragically, the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limits, has had at least 2 relationships with first-degree cousins. One produced a child who died at 3 months due to severe heart malformations, the other ended in a 5th-month miscarriage. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when consanguinity coefficients reach such levels, the chance of severe birth defects exceeds 50%. It is statistically more likely a child is born with severe problems than born healthy. The family survives solely on government disability benefits, about $800 monthly, which barely covers basic needs. They depend on neighbors' charity for food and clothing. Once a month, a church van brings basic groceries, canned beans, rice, stale bread, and powdered milk. The nearest clinic is 45 kilometers away, and the Whitakers have no transportation. They have no forms of entertainment besides sitting on the porch watching the rare car pass on the dirt road. Their existence is silent and without perspective. My first reaction was pure shock, Leiter admits. But then came the realization that a family in such extreme conditions had remained invisible to authorities for so long. The path to their home isn't even a proper road, it's a dirt trail worn by decades of use by a single family. When I finally saw the house, I thought I was looking at a horror movie set. The photographer recalls initially struggling to comprehend he was looking at human beings. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was it was some kind of sculpture or haunted doll. When he moved and made those sounds, I realized I was facing something I never imagined could exist. Leiter tried to communicate but quickly grasped the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one who could form recognizable words, but his answers were limited to yes, no, and a few isolated terms. I asked how old he was, and he said, a lot. I asked where he was born, and he pointed at the ground. The situation reveals deep systemic failures. Raleigh County, where the Whitakers live, is one of the poorest and most neglected regions in Western Virginia. With just 78,000 people spread over 600 square kilometers, social services are scarce and overwhelmed. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through Freedom of Information litigation, show local authorities were aware of the Whitakers' plight for decades but consciously chose to ignore it. It wasn't ignorance, it was a political decision to treat them as a problem that didn't exist. The documents reveal at least 8 social worker reports between 1985 and 2005 describing subhuman conditions on the property. Each recommended immediate intervention, each was filed without action by supervisors who deemed the case intractable. Morrison, a social worker in the region for 15 years, explains, there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains living in precarious conditions. Resources are limited, and cases like the Whitakers require expert intervention that simply isn't available in poor rural counties. The education system also failed completely. State records show that in the 1980s, truancy officers attempted to force the children into school. All attempts failed due to family resistance and the children's physical and mental states. The kids smelled strongly, couldn't communicate properly. Other children were scared, and teachers had no training to handle such severe disabilities. Negligence extended beyond education. Local newspaper reports from the Charleston Gazette-Mail in 1995 and 2003 document at least 2 investigations by social services into conditions on the property. Both resulted in reports that were filed without concrete action. The 1995 report described subhuman living conditions, absence of basic sanitation, evidence of medical neglect, and possible sexual abuse. The Whitakers expose the hypocrisy of a society that prides itself on family values yet abandons families that don't fit normative standards. The local community itself holds an ambiguous view. Some neighbors show compassion, bringing food and clothes occasionally. Others see the Whitakers as a local shame to be hidden, their condition a divine curse or payment for ancestral sin. This fatalistic resignation stifled decades of potential intervention. The Whitakers weren't just forgotten by the system, they were actively ignored by a community that preferred them invisible. The Whitaker story transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It speaks to American rural poverty, institutional negligence, failures in health and education, and the systematic abandonment of marginalized populations. Subsequent studies reveal the Whitakers are not an isolated case in Appalachia. What makes the Whitaker case unique is not the inbreeding itself, but its extreme duration and the complete absence of external intervention, explains Dr. Bamshad. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. But media attention also transformed the Whitakers into a kind of human zoo. Curiosity seekers began appearing, taking pictures and videos as if they were animals on display, raising complex ethical questions about consent and dignity. This attention did bring some practical improvements. Viewer donations allowed for a generator, a functional bathroom, and more regular medical care. Ray, now 68, requires constant attention for chronic infections. Lorraine, 65, has progressive respiratory issues. They are literally the last of their line, says Leiter. A family that has bred itself toward extinction. Yet the Whitaker history also serves as a warning. In America's poorest rural regions, thousands of families live in conditions of extreme social, educational, and medical vulnerability. Geographic isolation combined with poverty and institutional neglect creates ecosystems where similar tragedies can develop silently. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes, the Whitaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends affecting thousands in the region. Multidimensional poverty, cultural isolation, and government abandonment create environments where human tragedies like this are perpetuated for generations. Williams has documented at least 47 other families in Appalachia with significant histories of consanguinity, though none reach the Whitaker extreme. What we see is a gradient of vulnerability, she explains. The Whitakers represent the most extreme point on a spectrum of social neglect affecting the entire region. Parallels are disturbing. Families like the Blue Fugates, known for methemoglobinia, or blue skin, from inbreeding, or that heart wells, with hereditary dwarfism and cognitive disabilities, show the Whitakers are not alone. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional pattern of isolation and endogamy. Research by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals consanguinity rates in some isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads the initiative, states, "We're dealing with a public health crisis ignored for decades." The Whitakers represent the most severe endpoint of what happens when geographic isolation combines with economic desperation and social abandonment. The true lesson of the Whitaker family lies not in their deformed genetics, but in what their existence reveals about the deep failures of a society that refuses to care for its most vulnerable. They are an uncomfortable mirror reflecting not only physical deformities, but the moral and social deformities of a system that leaves those most in need of protection behind. Dr. Bennett offers a somber perspective. Scientifically, the Whitakers represent what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive to reproductive age. What kept this family alive was not their genes, but modern support systems. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Each day for the Whitaker siblings is a struggle against limitations no human should face. Their existence is both a testament to human resilience and a devastating indictment of a society that allows such suffering to continue. Today, as you watch this story comfortably at home with access to education, healthcare, and opportunity, the Whitaker brothers and sister remain in their home without electricity, without hope, without a future. They are ghosts of an America we prefer to pretend does not exist, hidden in the forgotten folds of a country that prides itself on opportunity for all. The Whitaker family will die in silence, as they lived. But their story will endure as a permanent testimony to what happens when a society decides some lives simply do not matter enough to save. They are the human price of institutionalized neglect, the genetic cost of social abandonment, and living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable, if only we care enough to prevent them. Their lives pose a question directly to our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the existence of the Whitaker family say about who we truly are? If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because stories like this reveal truths few have the courage to tell. If you've watched this far, you were impacted by this story. Leave a comment saying "watched here" so I can know who truly follows the channel. Leave a like if this story moved you in any way. Share this video so more people understand the realities our society prefers to ignore. Made with Red Heart #by